Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning for this session. We are very fortunate to have today to kick off this session some opening remarks from His Excellency Jose Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Through our MENA OECD initiative, we've been a strategic partner of the summit from day one. Every year, through the OECD Global Platform sessions, we look at the critical governance challenges, and of course that includes today, but mostly about tomorrow. Now we're looking at risks. This is governing future risks, and we're presenting to you all, and we're launching this assessing global progress in the governance of critical risks. You know, the risks make the headlines. The management of the risks are less sexy, but they are the only way to deal with the risks. So what we're down is at the danger of being less sexy or maybe less newsworthy is the question of how do we address the question of the risks. And the risks come in all sizes. Risk actually is, well, in the human condition, it is why our earliest ancestors evolved to live in groups. You know, they wanted to lower their individual risks. It's why we form communities to provide security, to provide safety to the groups, to the collective. And of course, then we created governments. And governments, first and foremost, are about protecting their citizens and therefore reducing the level of risk for each of the individuals and then for the collective as a whole. Now, over the past 2 decades, the range and complexity of the risks that governments need to manage have increased dramatically. In today's globalized world, risks are characterized by increasing interconnectedness. That makes it instantaneous. Just like communications are instantaneous, risk will be transmitted instantaneously. Look at the last crisis, and it was already 10 years ago. Technology was less developed, and then what happened was immediate. We were basically trying to find out what was happening in one place, and it was all over the place already. Social networking, fast-paced technological change. The challenging risk landscape includes cyber attacks, pandemics, terrorism, natural disasters, extreme weather events. Climate change is, of course, the most obvious, the most threatening, and the most important from the intergenerational point of view, but it's just one of the ones that we're facing every day. They are more intense, but also they tend to hang around longer, and the consequences are also more acute. Such risks not only endanger lives and property, they can also cause disruptions to the supply chain of food, energy, medicines. Just, you know, take this year that just finished, 2018. Wildfires, hurricanes, storms, tsunamis. 100,000 lives were lost. $217 billion of damage, according to some of the reinsurance companies. And that means all the part that was reinsured, that was insured. Of course, most of these were not insured or even reinsured, of course. Now, you're talking about a damage which is about the size of the gross domestic product of Greece, you know, just to give you an idea of how bad it was. How about the what is it called? The polar vortex in the United States, with the lowest temperatures since time immemorial, and then How about the other part, which is the warming, the warming, and of course the melting of the Arctics and the glaciers, etc. So you have a number of physical, what I would call, climate-related, environment-related risks, but you also have social risks. You have risks that have to do with inclusion issues or exclusion issues, and they happen in industry and academia, civil society. They come when you develop digital, and it's wonderful because it's giving us the capacity to access every single information in the world in an instant. And at the same time, as I was saying in the plenary a moment ago, it is threatening about 15% of the workforce to be displaced by technology, and about another third of the workforce to be disrupted somehow in their daily lives by technology. Those are risks that we did not have in our map, and that we have to deal with, because they are presenting society, they're presenting the collective, and they are presenting typically the most vulnerable with an enormous risk, and we have to deal with it. Now, the question is what to do about it, and then what is the role of the policymakers, but then what is the role of the rest of society? The question is, how much can you plan ahead? There are some cases where you can plan ahead. We recently, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, Marcos, we delivered to the city of Paris, the OECD delivered to the city of Paris. We're actually based in Paris, so it was a contribution to our host city, a plan against flooding. And they actually started putting some of the defenses in place. And last year, it happened. Whoop. And then what happened is that because of the planning that had taken place, the actual damage did not amount to what would have been the case had there not been the planning, had there not been the defenses that were built. Now, we're looking at things that could have cost hundreds of billions in terms of potential damage, and then again, we could plan for it, we could prepare for it. So in some cases, you can prepare, but in some cases, of course, like when you have tornadoes or when you have hurricanes, etc. But also when you have wars, or when you have processes of conflict. Whoever saw the risk that 3.5 million Syrians would now be living in Turkey, or 1.5 million living in Lebanon or in Jordan, much smaller countries than Turkey, and the risk that represents for them. Well, it was difficult. That was not foreseeable. And then that 2 countries would be falling apart at the same time, Syria and Libya. And of course, the pressure that has put on Europe. Was Europe prepared? Unfortunately, not. Not only because they were not prepared to deal physically with the pressure of the migrants, but also because they had not discussed the policies. And Europe today, if there is one thing that is dividing each individual country in Europe, is precisely migration. The attitude towards the migrants. Their whole, governments have changed. Governments have fractured. The political forces have fractured because that risk was not discussed. It was not a good thing to discuss. It was not considered, appropriate or popular, or people didn't want to engage in this kind of discussion. When the time came, we were not prepared, and then, of course, we are suffering the consequences. Some of the conclusions of the study here: a whole of government approach is absolutely paramount. That means there are 20 different ministries in every country, but there's also the private sector, there's civil society, and there are many, many elements. There are the cities which are not the national governments, and then the coordination between the national governments and the regions and the states and the cities and the villages, and you just go down the line. Then we actually have a toolkit on the governance of critical infrastructure resilience, and it provides some guidance here in terms of the how to deal with this whole of government approach. This is of our director, and our officials here from the Director of Governance are with us today. The second is governments need to articulate ambitious, defined goals and timeframes. Again, you have to start looking at what can happen, or what are the worst possible scenarios. And you know what they say: plan for the worst, hope for the best. But hoping for the best is not enough. You have to do the first thing first, which is plan for the worst, because it may happen. It may happen. In the plenary a moment ago, I was saying, why did we shave off 0.5% from the world's projection of their growth, the world GDP? We are saying now it's going to grow at 3.5% instead of 4%, and that in a 6-month period. How is it possible? I even called in my chief economist, and I said, this is not serious. You have just taken off, normally you go by 0.1 or 0.2, a little bit more, a little bit less. Suddenly they shave off 0.5 point. Why? He said, because everything that could go wrong did. And that means all the commercial pressures, the tit for the tat, and the increases in the tariffs, etc., and then the consequences, of course, for growth, which are uncertainty. And then in the face of uncertainty, people don't invest. Because why should they produce if they don't know if they can sell? So basically, again, planning for, there's some rather brilliant examples of a number of national security strategies which are better than others, and of course they are mentioned in the book in terms of who is supposed to be looking at the future with the most critical eyes, and as I said, planning for the worst and hoping for the best. Now, governments manage risks better when they have the evidence to constantly review, revise, and reform policies. Again, it is a duty. It's part of the duty to protect. And that means not just physically, but against the risks. Governments have the duty to protect, and therefore the question of preparing against the risks. And you have to be constantly reviewing. Now, why? Forget about the ethical part. Forget about the moral part. That, of course, is a very important element. But just the economics. Well, this is like health. If you invest $1 or 1 dirham or 1 euro in prevention, you will save 10 in the cure. The same thing happens when you have planned for the risks. And then if eventually the risk happens, materializes, you get the savings. In many cases, the risks come from decisions of people, not only from natural disasters. And when people know that the world is prepared, or that the particular country is prepared to face their own decisions, sometimes they don't even take the decision. So preparedness, you remember what they said, that you have to be prepared for war in order to keep the peace. Well, the same thing happens with some of the risks. If the markets know, if the individual operators know that you're ready to face them, then maybe they will not take those decisions. So, dear friends, let me close with the words of William Shakespeare. It's always safe to quote Shakespeare. And he has a phrase for everything. He said, "Out of this nettle, danger." So we pluck this flower and this safety. So danger, risks, they cannot be avoided, but it is within our grasp to at least reduce the cost, reduce the consequences, and reduce the staying power of the risks becoming a reality. So count on the OECD. Please feel comfortable with the OECD. Ask us, work with us. We are ready to work with you, but also for you in the avoidance and the management of risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now inviting to the stage Mr. Marcus Bonturi, Director of Public Governance at the OECD, and our esteemed panel of experts to discuss governing future risk that we just heard a little bit about from His Excellency Gaviria.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for very inspiring words. Just to say that we, in this age of erosion of trust in institutions, managing risks is one of the core functions of the state, and we need to do it right. And we're very lucky that we have a group of panelists who actually have as their core function in governments to manage those risks, and we'll hear firsthand from them some of the challenges that they face, some of the good practices that have been able to implement. I would like to call to the floor Your Excellency Mariam Al Mehairi, who is the Minister of State for Food Security here in the UAE. Dr. Dan Kaniewski, who is the Deputy Administrator of FEMA, who is the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States. Thank you, Dan. And Major General Adnan Al-Abbadi, who is the Vice Chairman of the National Center for Security and Crisis Management in Jordan. Thank you. And also to help us with the closing remarks, good friend, Minister Hala Al-Said, who is the Minister of Planning, Monitoring, and Administrative Reform of Egypt. Thank you very much for joining us. You all have very relevant experience in the issue of risk management, and each one of you with perhaps some different perspectives, with different portfolios, but indeed, I think together we'll be able to give the audience a view of the importance of this topic. If you allow me, Minister Al Mehairi, I will start with you. UAE is a country in the desert. You lack water, you lack arable land, and you had in the past faced some important challenges related to food security, especially during the food crisis 2007, 2008. You have a growing population, consumption needs are increasing. What have you been doing to improve the resilience of your food supply here in the UAE?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me. From those who've come from very far away, welcome to the UAE. So let me talk about what Christine Lagarde and Richard Quest were talking on stage yesterday. Remember, they talked about the formation of 4 clouds, and Christine Lagarde said we need to create that buffer to make sure that we're resilient. So if we now go to the UAE and look at the file that I'm taking care of, food security, this impacts the livelihood of millions of people. To be exact, 9.12 million people in the UAE, plus all the tourists that are here at any given time. So when we're looking at what happened in 2007, 2008, it was a real learning curve for us to go from managing crisis to managing risk. So it taught us the principles of good approach in deliberating risk governance was really important. So in identifying your risks, assessing them, managing them, communicating them. So this is now an approach that the UAE is taking in all its sectors. When we come to food security being to ensure the accessibility of food for all, we have to ensure that we're actually covering all the dimensions of food security, which is the availability of food, accessibility of food, utilization, and stability as well. So covering those sectors, we need to take a cross-sectional approach, which is what we did when we developed the National Food Security Strategy. We took the risk governance approach and we ensured that, number one, we made sure we had all the local authorities, federal entities that have a key element in the tasks of the food security were involved with us. We did kind of scenario planning with them or scenario gaming approach to ensure the elements of risks are all taken into consideration. Second, we leveraged the private sector as in a big way. We had workshops with them and ensured that their point of view and the risks that they're also foreseeing are also taken into consideration. Third, we ensured that we had a kind of a risk monitoring assessment scheme in the actual preparation of the food security strategy. The main thing is risk governance is a deliberate approach where you actually scan the institutional design, the inclusiveness, and the accountability mechanism in one go.
Thank you so much. This gives me the perfect introduction to Dan and the work he does in the US. Dan, I mean, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has a very, I would say, function in preparing and responding to disasters. We have this dual role, and you need to have a whole government approach, but also you need to ensure the participation of the private sector. And as the minister was saying, very, very important role of the private sector in helping the state in its function. So how would you describe this whole government approach in the US and the link with the private sector?
Sure, you're absolutely right, and thank you, Minister, for teeing it up so well. Indeed, everybody knows, I think, in this room, how busy 2017 and 2018 were for us in the United States with regard to disasters. I, as a matter of fact, started at FEMA the day that Hurricane Maria made landfall. I will tell you that in the 18 months since, we've done everything we possibly can to look back and do an after-action review and say, what did we do right? We need to highlight, and what do we need to do better? And we also need to highlight it, because the American public will not trust us as a government agency if we're not transparent. So I'd say transparency is bedrock principle for this. Likewise, for this to be effective, we need to be held accountable. So they're kind of held hand in hand. If we're transparent and say what we didn't do so well, what we need to improve in the future, we will be held accountable the next time. So in 2017, we had challenges. In 2018, we implemented many of those lessons learned. And again, refined and reassessed what we did right and what we did wrong. In 2018 as well, we issued a strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan that wasn't just tactical. It didn't say, what did we do right or wrong in these disasters? It says, what do we want to do in the next 5 years? And a key principle is engagement at all levels of government, with the American citizens. The thing that I'm best known for saying in the United States over and over and over again is that FEMA is not a first responder. The first responders you think of are the firefighters and police officers that respond to a scene, but honestly, it's not even them. In a catastrophic disaster, the first responder is all of you. And it's me. If the disaster hits my home or my town, I'm suddenly the first responder. So we need to empower our local citizens. And finally, with the private sector, they play a key role. Something we learned the hard way is that sometimes the private sector can do a disaster response mission better than the public sector. And sometimes the best thing we can do as government officials is get out of their way. Allow the telecommunications firms to go in and restore communications. Allow the private sector who runs many of the utilities in the United States, allow them to go in and turn the power back on. We need to get out of the way as the government and allow the private sector to do their job.
Thank you so much. That's indeed, we all remember being hit by success of hurricanes and other emergencies, the fires, and you've done a great job. Let me turn to you, Major General Adnan Al-Abbadi from Jordan. One thing we observe when we look at the different functions is that when a crisis hits, sometimes the usual rules, the usual protocols may not apply. You have to take hard decisions in times of crisis, and you need to improvise. You need to think of new ways of making decisions. In Jordan, how are the rules that govern the declaration of a national crisis, which will allow you the leeway to make those decisions, and how does the center operate really in terms of decision making at those times? And if you could come in also, because everybody's talking really this issue of coordination with the public, private, the security institutions. How do you work on the coordination to achieve the effective management of those crises?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. For me, the situation is a little bit different than what the other looks, especially 35 years in the service and the national security for crisis management. What's the most important, really, or the major role for the NCCM in Jordan is two major issues. First, we have to focus on the state continuity, then the operational continuity. State continuity, that means we have to be sure that to coordinate all at the strategic level, all the ministries, all the private, public sector, and security agencies that to work together from one crisis management position. All the effort should be united in one crisis man who is managing the country. And that's what we call the NCCM, the Command and Control Center. Operational continuity, that means you need to be sure that you follow the people on the ground. In any crisis should be there two crisis managers. The crisis manager at the strategic level who's leading the country at the diplomacy, political issue, and also there is operational commander on the ground who is communicate with all the people in Jordan. Also, as my friend mentioned, it's the center is like the FEMA, NCCM like the FEMA. Well, we are not the first responder, but we are the first who learn. So we have the CAT system like the 911. We get a copy from any incident in Jordan, tracking everything. Then we analyze it to see if that's really indication heading to the crisis or not. But the most important is in any nation in the world, I think, from my point of view, should have two major strategies. The first is a crisis management strategy, and the other strategy, which is very important, we just launched it maybe 2 months ago, which is disaster and risk reduction strategy. You can't estimate there is a crisis or not. With the climate change, the environment change, especially the Mediterranean area, a lot of environment, there is a lot of change. There's something we can't expect it. The last two incidents like flash flood in Jordan, we missed 35 lives of innocent people from the flash flood. That's something unexpected in Jordan. The nation should start think how we can cooperate as a region. For example, Jordan and the other countries, how to build a comprehensive early warning system for such a kind to give you indication if there's any deliberate crisis. Some of the immediate crises, like the terrorist crisis, go straight ahead to the strategic level, and some of the crises you can't even give you a time to estimate, like 15 to 20 seconds, which is like the earthquake. But I think cooperation at the strategic level, for me, state continuity and operational continuity, have your strategy for disaster risk reduction according to the Sendai framework. That's very important in any country.
Thank you so much. I think I have a little more time for a couple more questions, if you allow me. I'd like to follow up, Minister. And I was very interested, of course, what you said about preparations for food crisis. Given that you import most of the food, you know, how do you, when you talk about in terms of risk governance, how do you relate to the foreign countries where you're importing the food from? What kind of let's say your broad strategy? How does it work in terms of let's say the international component?
Yes. Okay, so first of all, identifying the risks. We are a country that imports more than 90% of its food. Therefore, we have to take into consideration what's happening on a global level. Climate change. Second of all, when you see population growth is going up, we're heading to the 9 billion mark. At the same time, food production is slowing down. We have a food gap increasing. Where are we going to get this food from when already our natural resources are exasperated in many parts of the world? Also us here, we don't have arable land, we're a water scarce country. How are we going to ensure a certain degree of food production as well? Third, it's us, our consumption patterns, the way we eat, food loss, food waste. When you look at the number of people that are going hungry is going up again. When you're looking at obesity rates, overweight, it's going up as well. So we've got two extremes that are happening. And at the same time, so you've got the whole misuse of food happening. So all these three things put together, we need to ensure that we're able to manage the risks that we're going to be foreseeing in the future. The UAE is very much, the leadership really looks into the future and strives to ensure that we are food secure now, but how do we ensure that we're food secure in the future, knowing of all these things that are coming up? So the risk governance taking into role, you know, aspects like identifying the hazards, where will they happen, where are the hot spots, how frequently will they happen, what is the duration, all this needs to be taken into consideration. And with these tools, we have to build things like national capacity. When we have an emergency, who's going to be running some of the facilities? Who's going to be doing what at certain times? So there's a lot in the emergency preparedness, which is one pillar on its own in the strategy, is a huge pillar on its own, which is, again, very much cross-sectional across many authorities. So taking this all into play, we really have to ensure that we're developing and growing and trying to reach the targets we want to reach. We want to become among the top 10 countries in the world that are food secure by 2021. And at the same time, we need to ensure we're building this resilience across the whole food supply chain. So looking at our investments as well abroad, looking at the partnerships we build, the food trade into the country, the food we're growing in the country, which is enabled with technology. We're trying to enhance ag tech in the UAE. Also reducing food loss, food waste, improving the way we eat. And then, of course, the emergency preparedness. So all that has to be taken into consideration. So it's a big task.
A complex challenge for sure. Then, on this issue, I mean, of course, the US has been hit. It's a big country, and it's been a succession of emergencies. And this issue, how can you learn from the experience? You know, the issue of self-evaluation. How do you approach that? How does FEMA approach this to ensure that you get better, you know, every time a new crisis hits?
Well, I would say that the biggest lesson learned from all those disasters is that we need to be better prepared for the future. And that means better operationally prepared as a nation to respond. But as the minister said, it also means we need to be more resilient for those future disasters. We need to reduce future disaster consequences now. And so, along with transparency and accountability, like I talked about, there's also a need to institutionalize this. And the way we institutionalized resilience is by bringing together all the various aspects of the agency that traditionally don't play a leading role. They're certainly not front and center when there's a disaster. And that would include mitigation, insurance, and preparedness. And now all of those organizations are under me, and it's about 2,500 people at FEMA that do resilience full-time every day. It's about a $500 million operating budget just for resilience, just for FEMA's needs. and then $3 billion a year in federal preparedness grants and mitigation grants that we provide to jurisdictions around the country so they can build their level of preparedness and enhance their mitigation. And then FEMA also has a flood insurance program where we insure about $1.2 trillion of risk, flood risk, in the United States. So we're taking it very seriously. And again, we've institutionalized this in a way that will enhance, I think, our preparedness, our ability to reduce these disaster consequences going forward. And it requires, if you think of it as like a three-legged stool, if I want to reduce the risk, I need mitigation, and I need insurance, and I need preparedness. Without any of those, one of those, that stool becomes wobbly, and without two, you can imagine what happens. Without three, well, we don't have anything to do.
Thank you so much for the metaphor. Listen, thank you so much for the panelists. This has been a very interesting discussion. Fortunately, we don't have more time. So I'd like to give the floor to the Minister, Hala El Sayed, for some concluding remarks. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the government of the UAE for organizing the government summit, and of course to the OECD for organizing such an important session and for inviting me to participate. Let me recap on two issues. Actually, countries across the world globally are facing increasing risks due to what Mr. Gouria was saying and what we have been listening. There is a lot of increased political risk, increased interconnectivity and technological enhancement. All this with the uncertainty that we are living globally, I think this puts a lot of pressure on the government. Also, increased awareness of the people across the globe of all our citizens' expectations and citizens' ambitions for a better living. And with the technological enhancement, I think this also puts a lot of pressure on the governments to be more responsive and to be more proactive towards all these risks that we are facing globally. And let me here just give you maybe an idea of what has been happening in Egypt. In order, we have during the past few years and after the political stability that we have started in 2014, we have taken three main measures. The first thing is to put different strategies based on identifying different risks that we face. We have, of course, put an overarching strategy, which is the Egypt's Vision and Strategy 2030. That's a strategy that is the national version of the SDGs 2030, and that's an overarching strategy that has been done through a participatory approach. The inclusiveness and the participation of the people is key. We have a lot of main participation from the private sector, main participation of the civil society, and think this was key in order to ensure having a proper strategy for the future. What is also very important about this strategy is that it had two cross-cutting different sub-strategies, which is the women's strategy and the youth strategy. We had made sure that we had a strategy for women economic and political empowerment. And as you have heard, maybe we have now 8 ministers, lady ministers in the government that are basically responsible for main portfolios in the government, not like before. In Egypt, we used to have a minister for social solidarity or for women issues. Now we have the lady ministers responsible for 8 main health, tourism, investment, administrative reform, planning. So it's more the core of the government business is basically given to women, in addition to the cross-cutting, of course, of the youth strategy. The other thing is that we made sure that the implementation process is not only putting strategies, because we could have the best strategies in the world, but you do not have the proper setup and the proper mechanism to make sure that this is being implemented through a monitoring and evaluation mechanism with targets, with key performance indicators. Of course, we're privileged to have the support of the OECD in this respect with the governance committee. So this is also very important to make sure that you have always a monitoring mechanism for that and being always disseminated in a profit form. The third parameter, which is the capacity building, because this will ensure the sustainability of all our strategies. We made sure we have, first of all, the president has, when he was having especially the new cabinet last June, he said that building a human being is the priority in this cabinet's mandate, and we had capacity building in all aspects, especially that we're privileged with having 60% of our population less than the age of 35. So they are basically our main asset in Egypt. We have established a youth academy specifically to make sure that they have the proper education, the proper training, the proper capacity building. Also, we have a lot of women capacity building. The lady is not only, I'm not talking about a gender issue, I'm talking about the woman who is basically affecting the future generation. She's the mother, so she has a key role in affecting the future generation, in taking care of our young people. So we have also a lot of stress on the women capacity building. The other important thing is that to ensure the proper implementation, we have a lot of enablers. We have a participation in with our partners like the OECD. We have made sure that we have an information system that is being developed through a lot of digitalization. And now we have the GFMIS, which is the Government Financial Management Information System. This makes us follow up on the public expenditure, on the efficiency of our investment. We have also now announced the Citizen Charter and the Citizen Planning and the Citizen Budget. So we have a lot of participation from the governorate and through decentralization. And we now, the law of decentralization is in the parliament. So we are about to ratify that from the parliament. And I think this will make sure that you have more inclusiveness in all your aspects. Definitely we have challenges that we have to face. We have a very complex government and we have an increased population. The Egyptians increased by about 2.5% every year. So we have about 2.5 million citizens every year. That's a new country. So that are our two main challenges that we have to face. But I think with the political will, with the right systems, right strategies, I think we will be able to match that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you very, very much. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time to continue this conversation here, but we're very interested we have at the OECD the high-level risk forum, and we're very interested in the context of the MENA program that we have with the region, that we have a forum to have this conversation. I think that you have very interesting experiences here in this region, and we're very, very keen to hear from you, to learn from you, and also at the same time bring the experiences of OECD countries on the issue of risk management. So thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you so much.